Section 24 of Richelieu by Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8, Literature, Part 2. Voiture was essentially a man of the world. He loved society, and was never so happy as when surrounded by all the minor stars of the Hôtel de Rambouillet. Balzac habitually lived away from Paris, on the principle, no doubt, that maior a longinquio reverentia. The fact is that he had been, he thought, slighted by Richelieu, and his vanity was sorely wounded. He retired to an estate he possessed in the province of Angoumois, but he took care at the same time to keep himself constantly before the public. He represents himself as perfectly besieged by applications for letters which circulated about from salon to salon, exciting universal admiration and forming the subject both of the talk and jealousy of all other aspirants after literary fame. At the very moment when I am now addressing you, we still quote, I have on my table 100 letters awaiting answers. There are some from crowned heads. My friends insist upon eloquent answers, answers fit to be shown, handed about, copied, printed. Balzac's chief works are Le Socrate chrétien, Le Prince, et Les Entretiens à Ménandre, in which he gave, before Pascal, the example of a serious and impartial style of controversy. In one word, Balzac is a perfect artist, but his writings never betray that feeling which makes us love the man. One of the most famous of the literary meetings of the early 17th century in France was that which sat at the house and under the auspices of the Protestant Valentin Conrart, whom we have already alluded to more than once. He was a man of great judgment, of the most unblemished reputation, and he enjoyed the esteem and friendship of the best-known writers of the day. Being on intimate terms with Balzac, Godot, and other literary characters who shared his taste for intellectual pursuits, he was fond of discussing with them all sorts of subjects bearing upon history, science, philosophy, and belles-lettres. In 1629, in order to give to these meetings greater regularity, he proposed to his friends that they should assemble at his house once a week. These gatherings lasted in the first instance for the space of 4 years. In 1634, however, having married Mademoiselle Muisson, and accepted the post of secretary to the king, Conrart felt obliged to close the literary reunions which he had originated and carried on with so much success, and the members of the society assembled afterwards, sometimes at the house of Desmarets, the well-known author of the comedy Les Visionnaires, sometimes at the poet Chapelain. It was then that a code of statutes was drawn up for the society, and 3 officers were appointed to manage its transactions. Of these officers, 2 were annually chosen, the chancellor and the director. The third, the secretary, was elected for life, and by an act of courtesy, which was certainly well deserved, this post was given to Conrart. It had been resolved at first that the meetings of the Academy should be kept secret, and for some time the resolution was strictly adhered to. But experience has more than once proved that such promises are never of long duration, especially when as many as 40 persons are concerned in it, and Malville, one of the academicians, having mentioned it to a literary friend of his, Farret, the news got to the ears of Boisrobert, a man perfectly forgotten now, but who in 1634 was one of the most prominent oracles of the day, and enjoyed the confidence of Cardinal Richelieu. If we believe Guy Paton, Boisrobert, although a beneficed clergyman, was notorious for the irregularity of his life. He had all the qualities of a thorough Epicurean, combined with a certain taste for literature and a spirit of repartee, which rendered him a great favourite at the Palais Cardinal. But even Richelieu could not resist the irritation which Boisrobert's scandalous behaviour created in the public, and he resolved upon dismissing him from his presence. The separation was a sad one, and if satisfaction had been given to the susceptibility of the religious Parisians, how, on the other hand, would the Prime Minister manage to get on without the company of the wit who amused him so regularly by his anecdotes, and caused him to forget the cares of politics and the burden of state difficulties? Feeling very unwell one day, he sent for his physician, who, after giving him a prescription, added, "Monseigneur, all our drugs will prove useless if you do not add to them one dose of Boisrobert." The advice was followed at once, and one of the first pieces of gossip which the restored favourite told his master was that of the creation and organisation of Conrart's Academy. The idea, he said, seemed to him a most useful one. It would encourage a taste for intellectual pursuits, and be most probably the means of introducing to the notice of the public Monseigneur's own dramatic compositions, the glory of the age and the pride of France. The intelligence thus given by Boisrobert to the Prime Minister came very opportunely. When Cardinal Richelieu heard about these conversaziones, he saw at once both the dangers which might arise from them if they became political clubs, and the assistance that they might give him if he wished to press eloquence and learning in the service of his own ambitious views. He accordingly sent one of his agents to sound these gentlemen, and to ask them whether they would not like to form a regular body, and to meet at stated times under the sanction of public authority. His proposition was very coolly received. Most of Conrart's friends would have far preferred their independence, and some of them, connected with noblemen who held decidedly anti-cardinalist opinions, were afraid lest by accepting the Prime Minister's offer they should be suspected of betraying their protector's interests and of wishing to act as spies. However, a desire expressed by Richelieu was almost equivalent to an order, and the Académie Française was established by letters patent dated July 10th, 1637. We have already alluded to the opposition raised by the Paris Parliament against this new creation of the cardinal. The resistance was absurd, no doubt, but it proved that the general feeling suspected Richelieu of wishing to stifle independence even in literature, and of carrying his despotic views beyond the limits of politics, strictly so called. It is not the place to examine here how far the creation of the Académie Française has been favourable to the progress of taste and of elegant composition. We shall merely say that the protector of the new institution, anxious to shine as an homme de lettres as well as a statesman, wrote several tragi-comedies which still exist, and of which it would be difficult to say whether the language or the plot is more ridiculous. The one called Mirame was brought out in 1639 on a theatre built in the Palais Cardinal on purpose, at a great expense. It could be performed only twice, as even his most ardent supporters could not get up enthusiasm enough to admire a play where the scenery alone was a success. Well, Frenchmen never had taste. Such is the remark which Richelieu philosophically made to his collaborateur Desmarets on seeing the indifference exhibited by the audience to the destinies of the unfortunate Mirame. Richelieu's influence on literature must not be measured by the fate which awaited his wretched plays. It is not too much to say that for the space of 20 years he was the centre, not only of the political, but of the intellectual world. Around him, as around their guide and their protector, we find the busy crowd of parliamentary orators, historians, memoir writers, gazetteers, legists. He understood nothing, it is true, about dramatic composition, but he protected the drama, and his encouragement of literature possessed this good quality, that it was not limited to a coterie or guided by jealousy. Richelieu besides, as a littérateur, has other titles than those of a poet. Let the reader turn, for instance, to the History of the States General, 1614, and let him study the speech which the Bishop of Luçon, Richelieu, made in his capacity as deputy of the clergy. Its merits are all the more apparent because they stand out in strong contrast to the heaviness, the stilted and affected mannerism of those which were delivered by the orators of the nobility and the bourgeoisie. Richelieu, as an excellent critic very appropriately observes, spurns college declamation, scholastic pedantry, and a useless display of erudition. His language is clear, precise, remarkable by its manliness. He goes at once to the end he has in view, and allows no obstacle to stop from his purpose. He speaks with the twofold authority of a bishop and of a politician. Those who wish to become acquainted with Richelieu as a writer must leave entirely aside his theological and controversial works, Ordonnances synodales, les principaux points de la foi catholique défendus contre l'édit dressé au roi par les ministres de Charenton, Poitiers, 1617, 8 volumes, Instruction du chrétien, Poitiers, 1621, 8 volumes, La méthode la plus facile est assurée de convertir ceux qui sont séparés de l'Église, Paris, 1651, folio. They must direct their attention to the numerous memoirs which the cardinal composed on contemporary affairs, and especially to his voluminous correspondence, which enables us to complete what history tells us about his character, and not unfrequently to correct certain impressions which we have almost unwittingly accepted on the authority of tradition. Thus we know the severity of the minister, his inflexible determination to punish his enemies, and to mow down every obstacle which stood in his way. We accordingly expect, on perusing his letters, to find expressions of blame and reproach freely indulged in, and visiting the smallest offence. Quite the contrary. Richelieu often pretends to ignore faults and petty neglects of duty which he does not want to punish. If he has to complain of a general, he leaves the care of writing to one of his secretaries, who informs the culprit that the accusing despatch has been concealed from the prime minister. When the necessity for chastisement is beyond a doubt, the blow falls, and falls heavily. But if a mere reprimand is all that is wanted, Richelieu takes the utmost care not to crush the zeal of the offender by letting him feel that there is no possible room for pardon. The Succincte Narration des Grandes Actions du Roi is a work of the utmost interest, for whilst the correspondence conjures up before our eyes the cardinal in his non-official and familiar character, we have here the statesman who appeals to posterity, the historian who gives a faithful and dignified account of his stewardship. The very title of the work arrests our attention at first. We see Richelieu anxious to save the susceptibilities of the monarch, whose pliable will it was his business to mould, and to whom he dexterously ascribes the honour of high deeds which would never have been accomplished if the directing thought and the acting hand had been those of La Vieuville or de Luynes or a Concini. We may consider the Succincte Narration as a splendid piece of apologetic composition, where facts instead of arguments plead Richelieu's cause, and justify him at the tribunal of posterity. The Testament politique is the necessary complement of this work. It was evidently drawn up by the order and under the direction of the cardinal, but by the hand of a secretary, and although the genius of Richelieu has left its mark upon certain portions of the narrative, and even certain details, it is tolerably clear that it did not receive from end to end the benefit of the master's revision and correction. Richelieu, we have already had occasion to say, possessed no small share of literary conceit. Just as, for his dramatic composition, he did not spurn the assistance of complaisant collaborateurs, so in the preparation of his memoirs he secured the assistance of writers such as Vialard, Marshal d'Estrees, and d'Agen. But he reserved for himself the pleasure of reducing into shape the materials which these persons had brought together. And in one of his letters he alludes with a certain amount of naive vanity to the pleasure he felt in representing, that is, giving an artistic shape, what had been the result of a great deal of toil and trouble. We have reserved for the last a curious work which created a great sensation when it was first published. We allude to the well-known Histoire de la Mère et du Fils, ascribed in the first instance to the historian Mézeray, but clearly and conclusively proved to have been Richelieu's own work. If we study in chronological order the innumerable documents and pièces justificatives which the cardinal has taken care to bequeath to us, we can now form a very adequate idea both of his character and of the events with which he was so closely mixed. We see him at first modest and humble, ready to accept all the objections raised against him by his correspondents, flattering and humouring everyone, and submitting to the humiliating necessities of political ambition. As he goes on, he becomes bolder. He ventures to give his opinion, to assert his own dignity, and when he has at last reached the position of a prime minister, he makes the weak Louis XIII speak as Henry IV himself would have done. The age of Richelieu offers to the researches of historical students a number of memoirs and political pamphlets which, although not particularly noticeable in point of style, deserve to be mentioned as important contributions toward the annals of a busy epoch. We may name here the autobiographies of La Vieuville, the Duc de Rohan, the Marshal d'Estrees, Pontchartrain, Bassompierre, Fontenay-Marie, and Montglat. The professed historian of the time was Scipion Dupleix, who, taking up and recasting the work of Charles Bernard, an obscure compiler, reduced it into shape and made of it a panegyric of the cardinal. The proofs, it is even said, were corrected by Richelieu. Pamphlet literature, as may naturally be supposed, was extremely prolific. Not that attacks against the government could be printed in France, but they either circulated in manuscript or were published in Holland, in Lorraine, in Germany. On the one side, Sirmont, Rollet du Châtelet, Mézeray; on the other, Father Chanteloube, Mathieu de Morgue, took up their pens respectively for and against the minister. Richelieu himself, if the report is true, not scorning to play the part of a satirist in the Mot à l'oreille and La France mourante. It would be difficult to find a spark of wit in these ephemeral productions. Le Pacifique, le Censeur, le Philotémie, le Confiteor du Henri IV, le Miroir de la France, l'Écho royal des Tuileries, le Caquet, l'Anticaquet, le Caquet des Familles, etc., etc. But they illustrate very well the state of public opinion, and they form the connecting link between the pamphlets published during the League and the Mazarinades. There is an anecdote on record that Richelieu ordered some colporteurs to read out on the Pont Neuf, in a loud voice, a violent pamphlet in which he was accused of every possible crime, together with the answer he made to his enemies, thus showing that he did not fear the verdict of France on his administration at home and his policy abroad. Voiture's Lettres sur la prise de Corbie is undoubtedly, from every point of view, the most remarkable of the political works composed in defence of Cardinal Richelieu. Written in a serious and eloquent tone, inspired by true patriotism, it is a masterpiece, and will outlive the amusing but tiresomely witty effusions which amused so much Madame de Rambouillet and Mademoiselle Paulet. In connection with this part of our subject, We must just mention Théophraste Renaudot, who, having obtained the patent of physician to the king, contrived to ingratiate himself with the prime minister, and obtained from him the twofold privilege of opening a sort of registrar's office for advertisements, notices of sales, etc., and of publishing under the title La Gazette de France a weekly paper which met at once with the greatest success. Newspaper literature may be said to date from the commencement of the 17th century. It made its appearance simultaneously, or very nearly so, in England, in France, and in Germany, under the influence of the same causes and as the result of the same requirements. At that time there was a universal desire of obtaining accurate and detailed intelligence of all the events of the day, and when Renaudot made his début as a journalist, he was perfectly amazed at the number of gazettes or journals which were clandestinely distributed, and the contents of which were generally narratives of some court scandal or vulgar piece of gossip. They were known by the name of Nouvelles de la Main, and so eagerly sought for that a whole class of literary bohemians lived exclusively by collecting from all quarters, and very frequently composing news and intelligence of the most miscellaneous character. Some of these gazettes were printed, others were circulated in manuscript. The popularity obtained by these early newspapers increased so rapidly that no circle, no coterie, no club was without its office, where news, both home and foreign, were collected, copied, and forwarded to subscribers who paid a sum proportionate to the size of the paper. End of section 24.